All right, good morning, everybody. This is topic 9.3 debates about the environment. So, what were the causes and effects of the changes of 1900 to the present? Will be our central question today. So, as we're going through this, make sure you're picking up the ideas of what the causes of environmental changes happening during this period, and then what were some of the effects as well. Okay. So there's a lot of debates about what the environment happens to the environment in the world, and we'll talk about some of the bigger ones today. But the curriculum, as we're reading here, is as human activity contributed to deforestation, desertification, a decline in air quality, and increase in consumption of the world's supply of fresh air. Humans competed over these and other resources more intensely, more than ever. Okay. So let's talk about some of the causes. And here we have some major changes that occur inside the human biospheres and such as a result of human activity. You have mass deforestation, desertification. You have water shortages. The effects on air as well. And then, of course, the competition for resources such as oil, minerals, become ever more needed. So some of the human activity that causes to this is the fact that we've had a massive population growth in the last 120 years or so, and it's going to continue to get bigger and bigger too. The population of the world at 1900 was 1.6 billion people. In 2000, just 100 years later, 6.12 billion, despite the fact they had two world wars and everything. And the big reasons for that, is improved medical technology, as we talked about in the previous lectures, as well as the green revolution, being able to provide more food with less people having to provide it. And so this all is going to play major roles into why our population continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. And as the population grows, you need more farmland. You need more ways to gain food to feed these people, and then you also need materials to house them, and then they need materials for maintaining a certain standard of living. And so the more people who demand more resources from the earth, the more effects it's going to end up having on the earth itself and the environment. So there's a lot of things that you can play in there. So urbanization, also another key factor. More and more people in the world are living in urbanized centers. When that happens, there's going to be less people who are going to be growing food. And when that occurs, you have more intensive forms of agriculture, such as slash and burn. You have, especially here in the United States with commercial agriculture, we're using means to make sure we replenish the soil and such, and putting nitrates and things like that into the soil does have some environmental impacts, despite the fact that it does help provide more food. You are creating GMOs and pesticides to get rid of certain species that could eat your crops, and then at the same time that affects other species. One important one to note is bees, and where bees are such an important process of the biosphere and ecosystems in general. Without bees pollinating certain crops and such, they don't grow. But bees are affected by the pesticides and the GMOs that have these natural pesticides in them that are causing bees to deplete and disappear. And so that's a very real problem. And that puts the strains on the environment, as I mentioned. So because of that, because of urbanization and the use of intensive agricultural practices needed and necessary to feed the people of the cities, then that has environmental strains too. And of course, industrialization and globalization. This is pretty obvious. As we make more stuff and become more materialistic and need more stuff, they need more resources from the earth. Every time we drive cars, we are leaving a carbon footprint. So it's just something that we as a species, all of us, are contributing in some way to the environment's degradation, I guess. I don't know how to put it, but yeah. Um, some of the impacts, and these are, we go without saying, resource depletion. The more stuff we need, the more stuff we need to mine, the more um, oil we burn, coal we burn to provide energy to make this stuff and so forth. It comes with the territory. Resource scarcity. I'm going to focus particularly on water. As countries develop more so, they sometimes will dam off rivers that go through multiple countries. Places like Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, they are being deprived of certain river systems that they've depended on for feeding their people and so forth, because China's damming up the rivers and such to create hydroelectric dams, because they're trying to waiver themselves off of coal. So there's water scarcities as a result of that. As global warming continues to occur, you have less snowfall, less rainfall in some places where you have large droughts that are occurring. This is very true in Africa, where you have lakes and rivers that are simply disappearing because there's just not as much water and snowfall on the sources of their water. So yeah, that's something that occurs. And of course, greenhouse gases and global warming and climate change are a major issue as well, that we'll get into a little more detailed. So this is actually part of the curriculum, and the written word of the curriculum is that the releases of the greenhouse gases and pollutants into the atmosphere contributed to debates about nature and the causes of climate change. So greenhouse gases I'll talk more about here, but pollutants is not just greenhouse gases. It's also things like CFCs, which I can't remember the full chloral, fluorine, I can't remember. But it's something that used to be in hairspray cans and used in refrigerators. But it's been banned by the EPA. I don't know if it is anymore with the way that the EPA is today, but it's a chemical that when it gets into the atmosphere, eats away at the ozone layer, and that was a very real problem back in the 80s and 90s, and that needed to be addressed. But greenhouse gases, CO2 being the big one, but there's also methane and other ones too. But essentially, they trap the Earth's heat inside the atmosphere, where like the sun's rays would be reflected mostly back into space and such. It's not being trapped into our atmosphere like a giant greenhouse, and it is gradually warming up our Earth and such. Human activity has been linked to this. There's pretty much a virtual agreement within the science community about that the human activity of industrialization, burning fossil fuels, and agricultural practices are all contributing to the reasons why our Earth is starting to warm up at a rate that is much faster in the history of the Earth. So that is something that the scientific community is pretty much agreed to, that it is what we are doing. But despite the fact that the scientific community has a virtual agreement on that, it is still debated very much in the public arena of politics and society in general. There's a lot of people who are the climate change skeptics, who do not believe that the activities of humans could change the Earth's atmosphere or cause global warming. Many of them think that it's part of the Earth's natural cycles, that it gets warmer and colder time and such, which it does. The fact, though, that the scientific data supports that it's happening at a much quicker rate than it has in any part of history. So that's something that is pretty concerning. But despite the scientific evidence that supports it, there are still many people who are skeptical, and a lot of it is because they do not want to accept responsibility that what we are doing is hurting our environment, and and if we need to fix it, then we have to change a lot of the ways that we live. And that's very hard to do. So that is where you have a lot of pushback from against the scientific community, and pushback against this idea that we're even doing anything that's causing it to happen. Despite the fact that there are skeptics, there are many world leaders who have called for a global response to try to work as a world community to try to lessen the effects of human activities onto the environment, to try to cut down on our emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And there have been a couple of summits and agreements that have been made by many of the and most of the world's countries. Um, the first one was in 1997, and it's the Kyoto Protocols in Kyoto in Japan. They met United States, Canada, Western European countries, um, Russia, and a few others and such. And they had made an agreement that they would work collectively to try to lessen the amount of emissions that were going in. Um, the the only thing that kind of was the hang up is that countries like China, who in 1997, China was still this building economy, and they depended very much on coal burning and other fossil fuel burning energy sources in order to continue to increase the production because their economy was in full get up and go mode. It was all the way. They were like increasing their economic growth by 6% every year, which is like incredible. And a lot of people think, how is that even possible? Well, China started off pretty darn low, and with very little economic industrial output, and now they're just keep going up and up and up. So China and India and other developing nations of the global south, well, not just global south, I think Russia might have been part of this too, but they wanted a basically special circumstances where they didn't have to do as much as some of the more developed countries as far as cutting down emissions, because for them that meant that they would have to cut back on their development and their industrialization, and they didn't want to do that. So the world essentially agreed to that, and most of the people who were involved in the Kyoto Treaty, the Kyoto discussions, signed into the treaty, but the United States did not, because in our system of government, the president can negotiate the treaty, but it has to be approved by the Senate. And in 1997, the president of the United States was Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat, and then the Senate was controlled and the House were controlled by the Republicans. And the Republican argument against the Kyoto Treaty was that it basically would put the United States economy with an arm behind their back in a fight against China, trying to develop. And they didn't want to, handicap themselves by having to adhere to stricter CO2 restrictions than China and India and other countries that they were competing with economically. So they didn't sign into it. But in 2014, I think it's 2014, another agreement was made. It was even bigger, and it had even more countries involved in it, and that was the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement was about trying to cut down emissions, every country playing a role in cutting down emissions as much as they could, to try to stop the world from getting 2 degrees hotter by the end of the agreement. I can't remember, what's it, 2030 maybe? And it's not going so great, but a lot of countries have really worked to try to cut back on their emissions, doing more renewable energy, and so forth. And almost every country in the world has signed and ratified into this treaty. I mean, if you see the little graph here, 146 countries in the world have signed and ratified this treaty, and they are partaking in these protocols to try to cut down on their emissions. Some countries have signed it, but they have not ratified it in their countries. So they've signed the agreement, but they haven't implemented it into their country quite yet. And then there are 3 countries that have not signed or withdrew from the agreement. Syria, which, if you know what's going on in Syria right now, I don't think climate change is their worst concern. Honduras or Nicaragua, which is trying to industrialize themselves. And so they didn't want to consent to this agreement. And the United States, which when this agreement was made, President Obama was the president, and he was very much for this, but it was never ratified because there was a Republican Congress who, again, their argument is they do not want to give the United States an unfair disadvantage in their economy by capping and limiting their emissions, because that kind of slows the development of the economy. So that was the fear. And then when Trump came into office, President Trump withdrew from the Paris Accords and basically said we will not be held to a higher standard than everyone else, even though we are one of the biggest producers of emissions in the world. Not the biggest, but one of the biggest. So that ends this one. What were the causes and effects of environmental changes in 1900 to the present? Make sure you answer on Canvas, and I will see you all later.